announcement again sometime. All right, I'll start recording. There are so many things about this piece by Josephn Bologne that I was humbled in the process of preparation and learning the piece, learning the history. And so today I'm actually going to focus quite a bit on history and context of his life. Rather than the score analysis of the piece. I'll do that at a different session, because I find the history and the context of his life so fascinating that I can't believe it's not a movie. In fact, I think there is a movie that's like quite a terrible movie, actually. I've just seen like as I'm doing the research, different image shots of the movie, and it really looks terrible. So, but maybe we'll do a watch party later and make fun of the movie. So first of all, there is so many discrepancies and disagreements and conjectures surrounding his life. And because there was quite a bit of novelization of his life in the 19th century, the picture we have of his life is actually clouded by these romanticized stories and novelization of fiction of his life. So it takes a little bit of detective work to separate the truth from fiction, and especially in this case and of his life, that is even more so. Thankfully, we have some wonderful musicologists beginning much more deeper work into this. But of course, comparatively to, let's say, Haydn or Beethoven or Mozart, the amount of scholarship that has been done on Josephn Bologne pales in comparison. So we have to be a little more critical about what we're seeing in writings, in documents, and try to have the ability to decipher, okay, what viewpoint is this coming from, right? So I just want to make that as a frame of reference. We're looking at and examining things, because as we have seen in conversations about composers in the past that's been neglected, scholarship of those composers have also been neglected, and it's an area in which there's a lot of need and improvement that needs to be done. So I'm not a musicologist, I'm just a conductor. So a lot of what I'll be presenting to you, I don't present as absolute truth on the matter, but it's an ongoing learning process. So I ask for that understanding, okay? But before I dive into the slideshow, we have to kind of set some ground rules about his name, because there's even conflicting and difference of opinion of exactly what name we should use. Is it Josephn Bologne? Is it Joseph Bologne? Is it Le Chevalier de Saint George? Is there an S at the end of the George? From what I can surmise, I think I can tell you what not to do. Okay, I think it's okay to call him Josephn Bologne. It's okay to call him Le Chevalier de Saint George, because those are names that were attributed to him and given to him in various stages of his life. But one thing that we should not be calling him, and I only say this once, that we should not be calling him the Black Mozart, because first, it's an offensive term. And in fact, if you go into even a little bit of research, you will quickly realize that in fact, he was older than Mozart to top it off. Two, many of the influences actually goes the other way, rather than from Mozart to Josephn Bologne. So to say he is a Black Mozart is a reversal of expectation, and just reflective of the attitudes of earlier scholars and those scholars and how they viewed him and his significance in music. Okay, so we will not use that term in talking of him. All right, let me go into my slide presentation. And I have to. Here we go. Can you see that okay? Can you, I can't see your faces. Can you just let me know if you can see it?
Yep, we can.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay. So his dates are actually quite important to put into context, 1745 to 1799. Oops, sorry. All right. He was basically born in 1745 in the French West Indies on a plantation on the island of Guadeloupe. And that could have been the end of his lot, right? But he had a couple fortunate things about his status. Now, his mother was a slave and his father was a nobleman who owned a plantation. And at that point, if you're born in that situation, most likely you would have remained a slave without access to anything other than that. But his father was a plantation owner, and at that point, there was a edict, which is this sort of yellow parchment, and it basically concerned how Blacks would be treated in the French American islands colonies. Couple things. His mother was, by all accounts, and described as one of the most beautiful women in the French West Indies. So historians say he owes his mother for his looks, and also for his father to not actually follow this edict for the king. And his father basically decides to take Joseph to Paris when he's about seven or eight. So in Paris, he basically, his father puts him into the Royal Polytechnic Academy of Weapons and Writing, which is a sort of the elite military school. And his teacher was a man named Nicolas Texier de la Bossière, excuse my French pronunciation, which is a person on the right. And he's a master swordsman and became a big influence, not only in Joseph's life, but in development of the modern fencing. So fencing was really a way in which people could make their way into society. And there's a saying, apparently Joseph's teacher had a saying, if you're not a good swordsman, you need not come to dinner. So he went through this rigorous training as a swordsman. And in about a year or two, Josephn Bologne became an expert fencer, and he began to compete against other swordsmen in Europe. And so by the time he's 13, this photo on the left is a sort of depiction of many duels he went through. But one in particular that became sort of infamous and brought him to attention was a duel between him and Alexander Picard, and no relation to Star Trek. But anyway, Picard had called Josephn Bologne publicly La Bossière's mulatto, which even in those times, it was a really loaded term. With this big crowd, which had pro-slavery and abolitionist spectators looking on, and they're putting bets on Joseph, he basically wins the match. And at this point, Joseph is only 13, and Picard, I think, is many years above him in terms of years of experience, but also in age. But as a result of this duel, he really rises to the attention. And basically, he is given the title of Chevalier de Saint George. And at this point, he's also beginning to be known in many different things. A picture on the right is a description of him in boxing. So fencing, boxing, and there's a story about him where apparently he has swam across the river with one arm tied behind his back. So he is a physically very gifted athlete. But at the same time, and this is where it gets a little murky in terms of his training, but he's also beginning to be accomplished in his violin playing and beginning to be known about his multi-talented skills as a fencer, as a violinist. John Adams, who's a US ambassador to France at this time, describes Joseph Bologne's marksmanship with that phrase. He will hit the button, any button on the coat or waistcoat of the greatest masters, and so on. So in fact, if you look up a picture of Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges, you'll actually find the picture on the left oftentimes. And I thought there was a violin bow. And I realized it's actually a fence repair. In fact, some have said the picture on the right is a sort of a post-production photoshopped version where they take what was a fencing grip into a bow and violin. So I'm not sure whether that's actually true or not, but most of the pictures that you find in the archives are the kind where he is holding a fencing rapier. Basically, mostly through his fencing skills, by the time he graduates from the Royal Academy in 1766, and by this point he's 21, he's made into the officer in the court of King Louis XV. And from this point on, he's basically known rather than as Joseph Bologne, but as Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges. So now that title allows him access to all kinds of connections and patronage in the court, among the noble class. Chevalier uses this to pursue his interest and career in music. In 1769, he begins playing violin in this orchestra called Concert des Amateurs. And that's sort of on the left here is a document of that group. And despite its name, it's actually a group made of the best musicians in Paris at the time. Basically, he starts playing in this group as a violinist. And within 4 years, he's promoted to concertmaster and music director of this orchestra. And then 2 years after being the music director of this orchestra, it is basically accepted that this group is pretty much the best in Paris. So it's basically the Berlin Phil of Paris at the time. I have a recording here. Let me play this for you a little bit. All right, so you kind of get a taste of the virtuosic writing that he was doing. He was writing for these violin concertos, often that he was leading as a soloist in this orchestra. So there's really no known document about his early musical training, but he was known as a prodigy. And there are many composers like the two pictured, Francois Joseph Gossec and, oh, there's a misspell, Karl Stamitz, who have written and dedicated pieces to Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges. So as he becomes a leader of this orchestra, Le Concert des Amateurs, the leader of this group, who's Gossec, who you just saw before, right? He was actually the leader and conductor of this orchestra that he joined. And then in 4 years, Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges becomes the conductor. And then Gossec goes on to find another orchestra. But basically, he's really growing his power as a musician, as a soloist in violin, but also as a composer. So Gossec goes over to find a new orchestra called the Concert Spirituel, and he designates Saint-Georges to be his successor of the Concert des Amateurs, and that group is really growing. And basically, at this point, he's no longer sort of on the fringes of Parisian musical society. He's sort of in the center of it, and his powers is going to the point where he's in favor with the court, with Louis XV, so that he's basically kind of being groomed to take over the Paris Opera to be the music director, which doesn't happen, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Yeah, I want to play. I don't want to talk too much. I want to kind of sprinkle and give you as much of the taste of his music as possible. So here's another example of his violin concerto. This one is a slow movement. The other one was a kind of a fast first movement. So I will actually make this slide document available to you so that you can go back to listen to all these musical examples in full if you wish. But one of the things that often happen with virtuoso instrumentalists turned composers is that they tend to write music that is really more about technique and more about virtuosity and then musical content. But I think many of the performers who've played his music, many of the conductors who've conducted his music, many of the musicologists who are examining his pieces, it's not really a composer that is only about virtuosity and technique, but it's also a composer who has a lot of depth and expressivity. So there's a little bit interesting, you have to do a little bit of contextualizing the data that you see, right? So his instrumental music, this is sort of a rough outline. I'll send a link to on IMSLP. Actually, all right, so let me just review. So his instrumental music, he starts with a Opus 1, 6-string quartets published and inspired by Haydn's earliest quartet, 2 more sets of 6 quartets, 3 forte piano and violin sonatas, sonata for harp and flute, 6 violin duets, and then these 3 pieces are lost: cello sonata, concerto for clarinet and bassoon, 14 violin concertos, 2 symphonies, 8 symphony cantatas. So if you follow this link, it'll hop you into the IMSLP list of works by Josephn Bologne. Of course, here they have the wrong name there. Anyway, so it gives you the date it was published, the scoring, the actual title of each of the quartets in the Opus 1, and so on down the line. So you can kind of see from, he begins writing instrumental music 1773, and then it goes to about Opus 79. And then, of course, there are works that are unpublished, and perhaps lost, right? But what's interesting is after 1779, you don't see a lot of instrumental music being written. And in fact, he switches over to the opera form. So he has written, that we know of, 6, perhaps 7 operas, because one of them is a pastiche. There's an opera, his actually first opera is Ernestine in 1777, then 78, 87, 80, 87, 88, 90. Of these, the only one we have is L'amant anonime. That's the only one that is surviving. And there are all these other lost works. So, and on top of that, all of these works, it doesn't mean they're all published. Some are still in manuscript form and needing a lot of scholarship to be able to be played. So, so this date is important to put into context, because he basically stops writing instrumental music in 1779. Seriously. And there may be a number of reasons, but he starts to focus on opera from 1780 on. And so you have to start to ask a question, why is that the case, right? So before I answer that, I'll just plant that as a seed of question that for you to ruminate, and then I'll keep going. Let's go back to, okay. So later, I'll send you a great video done by James Collin, who is the conductor of the LA Opera, and their recent production of his only surviving opera, The Anonymous Lover. He does this hour-long video, and he talks a lot about the opera's, how the opera fits into the context of the era and all of these. But one of the things that I'm going to focus on are 2 aspects of that video, which is his contact with Mozart and Haydn. So Mozart, as you might know from history, visited Paris 3 times. And unfortunately, well, first time he was a child prodigy being, presented to the courts by his father, and he was very young. But this 3rd time, if you follow this first link, it'll take you to an article which is really fantastic about that particular year, 1778, and it's titled "Mozart in Paris: A Dark Chapter in the History of his life." So basically, he comes to Paris thinking he's going to find commissions and be welcomed into the courts and find fame and money. But in fact, none of those things happen. In fact, his time in Paris was so wretched, including the death of his mother in July of 78. And he really reaches rock bottom in terms of not having commissions fulfilled and basically not making any money. It's just sort of a big failure, this trip to Paris. And if you go back and you click on the second article, and Jessica Duchen of The Independent writes this really fascinating article that sort of makes a detective work about whether Chevalier de Saint George met Mozart and what their relationship was. And she surmises that, in fact, it was much darker. That Mozart, in fact, was so jealous of Chevalier de Saint George because at this point, Chevalier Saint George is very favored in the courts. He is basically a music teacher to Marie Antoinette, and Marie Antoinette and Louis XV are basically they are gushing about this wonderful composer. In fact, Mozart is trying to take his place in terms of being able to write music for the court, be Marie Antoinette's teacher. There's even a story of when Mozart had met Marie Antoinette. So this is when Marie Antoinette was not in Paris, but she was the empress, daughter of the Empress Maria Theresa. So I'll highlight the story. So apparently the little princess, which is the future Marie Antoinette, fell when she was 7, and he fell and she helped him up, and then he gave her a kiss, he being Mozart, saying he'd like to marry her. So for a long time, it was Mozart's dream to be really in favor of this French court. But when in fact, when Mozart arrives in 1778 to be in Paris, thinking that he can be that person, well, there's already that person in there, and that is Le Chevalier de Saint George. So this article really tries to kind of connect the dots that Mozart was in fact quite jealous of Le Chevalier de Saint George. And so here's an important aspect. So Baron von Grimm is the common point between the two. So when Mozart visited Paris, it's with Baron von Grimm that he stays in the same house. And in fact, at that period, under the same roof, Le Chevalier Saint George is staying as well. So everybody, including James Collin, is surmising it's that 6-week period where they both spent time in the same household under the same roof is when they met each other. Okay, so here's another thing. Let me go back to the. So let me find the Symphony Concertante. Okay, so Symphony Concertante by violin, viola, for violin, viola, and orchestra by Mozart is probably one of the most beloved pieces by Mozart, right? Koschel 364. And if you actually go to look up the term Symphonia Concertante, all right. So I found this is an example of it defines a Symphonia Concertante here, and then in the classical period, this is what it says about the Symphonia Concertante. There is no mention of Josephn Bologne at all, and in fact, it suggests that in fact it might have been two sons, the London Bachs, the youngest son of Johann Sebastian Bach, who invented the form Symphonie Concertante in Paris from early 1770s on. Okay, so and then it says Mozart, acquainted with the Mannheim School from 77, probably aware of J.C. Bach's publication, put considerable effort into attempts to produce convincing Symphonia Concertanti. His most successful are the following: the violin, viola, Koschel 364, which is pretty much his only Symphonia Concertante, and then there's also the possibly inauthentic Symphony Concertante for oboe, clarinet, horn, bassoon, and orchestra, Koschel 297B. So those are the only two that Mozart ever wrote. And even Papa Haydn only wrote one during his visit to London. Okay, so now let me go back to the, Okay, so if we go back to that IMSLP document, right? So Le Chevalier Saint George in his instrumental period writes Opus 6, 1775, Opus 8, 1777, and this is crucial, Opus 10 and Opus 13 in 1778. And Opus 10 is for 2 violin and viola. All right, so, okay. Now, basically, Symphonia Concertante was Josephn Bologne's favorite form of concerto. Well, he wrote 14 violin concertos, so maybe second favorite form. I mean, he only wrote 2 symphonies. So he preferred writing after 14 violin concertos, his favorite form after the violin concerto was writing 8 Symphonia Concertants. Okay. And he writes them 75, 77, 78. Remember, 78 is Mozart's 3rd visit to Paris. And according to Wikipedia, they conjecture that the influence actually came from Johann Sebastian Bach's son. So James Collin is making the suggestion that, in fact, it's Josephn Bologne who had more influence towards Mozart in terms of the Symphonia Concertante. And in fact, in his video, he plays an example of Josephn Bologne's Symphonia Concertante and then Mozart's Symphonia Concertante, and the similarity is really striking. Okay, so I just thought that was really, really cool. Okay. So that's sort of Mozart and Josephn Bologne's connection. Now let me go to Haydn. So this is a map of percentage of Haydn symphonies performed at the Concert Spirituel from 77 to 79. Remember, Concert Spirituel is Gossek's orchestra, which was Gossek was the previous music director to Les Concerts Amateurs. So that's sort of the 2nd best orchestra. Well, it was the best orchestra in Paris, which was overtaken by the Chevalier de Saint-Georges orchestra. But basically from 77 to 90, what's in blue is all other composers. What's in red is all the symphonies by Haydn. So you can see how popular Haydn was during this time in Paris. Okay, now, I need to give you a little bit of history about Chevalier de Saint-Georges' music directorship. So he plays in that orchestra for 4 years, becomes the concert master / music director, and leaves on it for 2 years, and then it becomes really well established, renowned in Paris. But no fault to his own, that orchestra goes out of business, partly because of the American Revolution and the loan that was given to was not paid back. And so it was a whole mess. Chevalier de Saint-Georges approaches his friend to find a brand new orchestra called Concert de la Loge Olympique. And Count Dagny, who's the Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge Olympic. And there's also a connection between Mozart and Josephn Bologne, both being Masons, Freemasons. So anyway, this new orchestra called the Concert de la Loge Olympique is basically pretty much the same personnel of his first orchestra, but now it's funded by this Masonic League. And it's this orchestra called the Concert de la Loge Olympique that commissions Joseph Haydn. And in fact, Chevalier de Saint-Georges is not only the person that negotiates the contract with Haydn, but in fact is the conductor that leads the performances of the now famous Haydn symphonies. In describing the first performance, these performances of the Haydn symphonies, first of all, the orchestra, that's Le Concert de la Loge Olympique, was a pretty large orchestra in that time, standard. It included 40 violins, 10 double basses. So that's, it was an extraordinarily huge orchestra for the time. Now, in comparison, Haydn's own orchestra at the Esterházy estate was never larger than 25 people in total, right? So if you look at his Haydn symphonies, like his mid-symphonies up till 80, and I believe the Paris symphonies begins in 82, 83, 84, 85, 86. Those 6 are the Paris symphonies. Everything before 82 are basically enough written for the Esterházy ensemble of about 25 players. So it often involves only 2 oboes and 2 horns, maybe 1 flute. But then the Paris symphonies start to involve much more instruments. And also Robbins Landon, who's a big Haydn scholar, describes the concerts by the La Concert de la Loge Olympique. And because Queen Marie Antoinette would often come unannounced to these concerts, the performers always wore these really elaborate dress coats in sky blue with swords at their side. So it was really kind of the performance ensemble in Paris. So the people that commissioned is basically Count Orgny, who was this aristocrat. He played cello in the orchestra, but also as part of the Masonic Lodge, was the main funder to this new orchestra that the Chevalier de Saint-Georges conducted. And in fact, when Count Dorny died, he left he spent so much money on not only the orchestra, but in commissioning, in costs associated with this orchestra. There's apparently a debt of 100,000 livres at the time, which was a huge amount of money. Okay. So I don't know the name of the awful movie, but this is another awful movie surrounding apparently their relationship, in quotes, between Marie Antoinette and his tutor, Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges. So what you see on the right is the Paris Opera. And through these, as his fame was rising in Paris, he was really being groomed by the court, Louis XV and Marie Antoinette, for Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges to take over the Paris Opera as a music director. But apparently there's a lot of intrigue, and there was another person who was interested in becoming the music director. So there was a lot of countermeasures that prevented Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges from being named the music director of the French opera. So he was really set up well at this point, even though the intrigue prevented him from becoming the music director of the French Opera House. Of course, the French Revolution hits. And if you are tied to the aristocracy and the court, well, then you're not in a good place when the revolution happens. So how Le Chevalier Saint-Georges responds to the revolution is a really interesting another set of history. And I could actually spend probably another hour in this history lesson. So I will leave the links, but you can read about those and follow what happens. Basically, he joins the French Revolution and leads with Dumas, is another fellow officer who's a Black that he graduated with in the military school. So they lead this legion during the French Revolution. But just because people are against the aristocracy and they're in the French Revolution doesn't mean they're not racist. So he was still facing a lot of challenges in being part of the Free Legion. Basically, to make the long story short, he follows the French Revolution, but then he's basically jailed for 18 months because he is being accused of being part of the aristocracy, but then he's freed. But then after that, he tries to get his musical career going again. But of course, that becomes very difficult with the lack of aristocracy and any kind of patronage system. So he pretty much dies in not in an unmarked grave like Mozart, but that's why a lot of his music is lost. And so there's this unfinished legacy that we're dealing with, where it's hard to find his scores, his manuscript. There are many pieces missing from the repertoire. The recent efforts like the LA Opera production of the Anonymous Lover was a fantastic production, and there's resurgence in studying his works and getting to know his music better. There are better editions, and in fact, I would really encourage you to. I'll put it in the. Here, let me Where did it go? I'll put in the link. James Collin does this hour-long introduction to the opera, which is really fantastic. And so I'm pretty much at the end of my presentation. I have a couple more links in this resource, which is the resource link. And let me just talk about how to use this resource link. So here are the scoring parts, right? If you click on that, you get the scoring parts. So you can click any of these and start working on it. And there's also a score. What I've also done is added some performances, one by one with a scrolling score, and then one by Tafel music on Baroque instruments. There's a recent one done by students at University of Southern California. So what I've done is, if you notice, I put little CK at the end of these links. What I would love for everybody to do is find a resource, whether it be a video of a performance, whether it be an article about Josephn Bologne, whether it be an article about the overture, and put it into the document. And then everybody would put in one unique resource, and then you would review somebody else's resource, 3 of them, and then sort of put a comment, right? So if you say, all right, I'm gonna leave a comment. Wow, that is very different in a lower key, or something like that. All right, so that we're finding a resource and then commenting on the resources so that it becomes a resource that's useful in helping us perform. It'll be helpful to other orchestras when they encounter this piece. Okay, and then it's the same thing. And then I put a link to another performance. So what I'll do is I'll make this link available for you to look at and listen to the links later on. Okay, I was hoping to get that done a little bit faster, but I only have 4 minutes for question and answers. So questions? No questions? So this is the biography by Gabriel Banat, who is a former violinist in the New York Philharmonic. I'll put this on reserve in the library. It's a fantastic biography. And in fact, it kind of reads like a mystery novel, because I'm reading and I'm like, that cannot have real, oh, so his life has so many confluences of directions and influences. It's really a fascinating look at 18th century Paris. And he goes through a tumultuous time of change, from aristocratic establishment to the French Revolution, and going through that, right? So it's really interesting how he responded as a Black man living in 18th century Paris, and making his way as a swordsman, then an athlete, then a musician, composer. Okay. All right, I will stay on. If you have more questions, I'll stop recording.